I'm super excited to be here. I love this topic, and the big challenge is trying to decide, what to cover in an hour, because there's so much great information on this topic. And we have a very broad audience. We have over 1,000 people here right now, approaching 2,000. And we know that we have people from high school all the way up to people in their 90s. And we have some incredible endurance athletes, like some of my husband's friends. Hello out there. And then we know from the registration questions that we also have some people who are just trying to fit exercise into their lives, and they may have some impediments to doing that. So it's a wide range of topics. I think I've designed this class to have a little something for everyone. So I hope you enjoy. So let's get started. And so let's start with the title. So body hacking. So how did I come up with body hacking? Well, first of all, I want to say that it should be body hacking for the sane. Because if you look online for body hacking, there's all sorts of crazy information out there of people injecting green goo into their arms and bionic limbs and microchips and things like that. And my goal today is to really give you tools that you can use when you leave this webinar to make your life healthier. So if you look at the definition for body hacking, it's to manipulate a biological system to obtain a desired result. And for me, physical activity is exactly that. It's a way to manipulate many biological systems to obtain a desired result, whether it's longevity, better health, performance, six-pack abs, whatever it might be. So it is do-it-yourself biology. But it's kind of a shame that we have to consider physical activity as a hack, because in our evolutionary past, physical activity was really part of our life. It was integrated in our life to get food, to get water, to find shelter, take care of children. And so, we used to do a lot of physical activity, so it wasn't a hack. And Daniel Lieberman, who is a paleoanthropologist at Harvard, sort of popularized the idea that we were the ultimate endurance animals, and that we could run down our prey run for hours until the prey would keel over. We could walk up to it and bonk it on the head. It would keel over from heat stroke. And so there was this popular idea that we were born to run. And more recently, he's sort of qualified that information and really come through that we're not so much born to run. We are excellent runners, but we are really born to survive by expending as little energy as possible. And that's part of the problem, is that it's in our DNA to actually be sedentary, to conserve energy, which isn't a problem when you have to go about foraging for your food. But as you can imagine, it's a serious problem if you're living in the modern world where we value convenience so much. So we have 24-hour food markets. We have, corner stores everywhere. And we have engineered physical activity out of our lives. So we have a lot of screen time. We sit in cars a lot. We go for convenience, like taking the escalator instead of the stairs and using the elevators. We have washing machines and dishwashers, and we order much of our supplies online through Amazon or wherever, especially during the pandemic. So we're not even going out and foraging in for our retail therapy anymore. It's only getting worse, actually. So here's a quote from the New York Times. If you're making the customer do any extra amount of work, no matter what industry you call home, you're now a target for disruption. So there's this idea that to cater to the customer, you have to give them convenience. You have to make their lives easier. And here's one small example that appeared in my inbox through Indiegogo. And it's an automatic sliding pet door. And your dog walks up to the door and the door opens. And I think this is a great idea. I have a dog. But what struck me was when I was looking through the testimonials, and this one from Mark S., for example, I never have to get off the couch again. Yay. So we're all striving to be as sedentary as possible. And this is rolled over into our work as well. So if you look at agrarian societies like the Amish, they average about 48 hours per week of work movement. In the modern office, you're about 2.7 hours per week of work movement. And it's really only gotten worse. So during COVID, for example, when people are working from home, I'm working with the Stanford Center on Longevity that's been collecting data on this. And they found that if you can work from home 100% of the time, then 65% of those people have shown that they've increased their sedentary time during COVID by greater than 2 hours per day. So it's a major load to sedentary behavior. So what have we done? Well, we now use exercise to compensate for that. So exercise is actually a modern construct, because you can't imagine hunter-gatherers going out to run for 5 miles just for the heck of it, because you'd have to then compensate for that by getting additional food and nutrition. And so it's just not done. So now we've compartmentalized our exercise. We've created this category. And before COVID, we used to go to gyms and work out side by others. We use electricity, we pay money to do that. And we go to SoulCycle and we sit on our bikes and we work out with, the person's butt right in front of us here. And I used to go to the gym with a friend who would circle and circle the gym, looking for a parking space so that she could get out and then go and walk on the treadmill in the gym. And when you say it like that, it kind of seems ridiculous, right? But it kind of get it, because you have this, you have this period of exercise that you've separated from the rest of our lives. And if you could integrate those back together, then that would be really useful for our own health and for the planet and the climate. So as a result, we've created these exercise and physical activity guidelines. And the problem is that many people don't meet those guidelines, right? So if you look at statistics, it's about 20% of the US adults fully meet the guidelines. And we'll talk about what the guidelines are later. But the bottom line is there are a lot of reasons for that. There's not enough time, there's, taking care of your children, there's your work situation, and also this idea that we are not programmed to voluntarily expend extra energy. And so people don't really like exercise. And often when I talk about exercise, this is the response I get. Exercise, I thought you said extra fries. So it's really difficult to get people to do it. But it's a shame, because physical activity is really the healthy aging pill. And you've probably heard this before, that physical activity, if it could be bottled and sold, it would be the most popular pill ever to exist on Earth. It has so many broad-reaching benefits and so few side effects. So when you look at the literature on aging, it's kind of grim, right? So you have a decreased endurance and decreased strength and decreased function, and that leads to decreased physical activity, and genetics play a role. And then you have energy expenditure falling, so that leads to obesity. And then you have an increase for risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and a fall in cognitive function. So it's pretty grim. But when I look at this, I look at it with a great deal of optimism, because right in the center of all those things is physical activity. So it's not really your destiny. If you can increase your physical activity, then all of those other arrows will change their direction. So you can increase endurance and increase strength and increase function. And all of these risk factors for disease will decline, and your cognitive function will decline, and cognitive function will improve. So you have this powerful thing right in the center of your physiology that impacts so many different elements of your health. So this is a big list of things that physical activity impacts, and there are actually a lot more out there. The ones in blue are the ones that you had homework on. And I know since you're all great Stanford students, you did your homework. But in case you didn't, those links, those video links are still available. And in these videos, we talk about sort of what the specifics are that improve those different parameters. And so muscle strength, cardiovascular, bone and health, and joint. I also gave you some questions to ponder. And I hope by the end of this class, you will have had some answers to some of those questions. We'll talk a little bit about brain today, and we won't quite have time to get to cellular aging, but there's some amazing work going on showing that physical activity goes all the way down to the cellular level, that it changes your telomere lengths and your mitochondrial number, and it has better mitochondrial repair. So there's a lot of very interesting work there that if you take my online class, you will learn more about. So we'll touch on some of these topics today, but obviously not all of them. So 85 years old can look really different. It can look like this gentleman here who's in a nursing home and dependent on others for all of his activities of daily living, or it can look like Alma Kent here, who's out doing the London Marathon at age 85. And if I were to ask you who you'd rather be like at age 85, I'm sure you'd all pick Alma, right? She's out there doing her thing, living life to the fullest. And so there are things that are out of your control in your life that might change your trajectory one way or the other. So injuries, diseases, bad genetics. But there are also a lot of things that you can do throughout your life to change your trajectory of aging away from this direction and more towards Alma. And we call that healthy aging or successful aging. So the general outline for the rest of the class is to talk about common sense stuff first, and then nerdy science stuff that I think will blow your mind. And then what's the minimum amount of exercise you need to do for health? And then is there a maximum amount for health? Is there an upper limit? And then I hope those will lead into my recommendations for activity as you age. So training for performance and training for longevity, which are two separate things. So common sense stuff about function. So physical activity improves and or maintains physical function. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? You go out, you train for a marathon, and you get stronger, you get faster, right? If you're keeping physically active as you age, your functional capacity will be improved. So I'm going to talk about a couple different, I'm going to give you some numbers associated with this though, to give you a better sense of how powerful this really is. So first we'll talk about maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max. So the maximum amount of oxygen your body can consume. And it's considered the gold standard for cardiovascular fitness. So the reason it is it takes into account all these different elements. So ventilation, moving air in and out of your lungs, diffusion, getting oxygen into your blood, saturation, cardiac output, so how much blood is moving around your body, the blood flow down to the tissues, and then your tissues extracting that oxygen to use to power your metabolism. And VO2 is proportional to work. So the higher your VO2 max, the more physical work you can do. So in order to optimize your VO2 max, you need to optimize all of these different components. So here is a figure looking at endurance trained women and sedentary women across the lifespan. So this is a cross-sectional study. And over here you have VO2 max on this axis and then age down here. And so the first thing you probably notice is that the curves decline over time. So VO2 max falls over time. And if you watched your homework videos, you'd know exactly why that is. But so age is an important component with VO2 max. But you also see that there's a lot of variability here at every age. So this 70-year-old here has a VO2 max that's higher than this 25-year-old here, right? So there's a lot of variability. You may also notice that this line drops a little bit faster. So the endurance trained line drops faster than the sedentary line. So there's a convergence of those lines. And so what's happening up here is that you're not only getting the physiologic changes, but you're also getting a fall in the ability to train as hard. So for those of us who are getting older, you know that it's just harder to put in the hours, that the injuries last longer, you need more recovery time. And so training volume and intensity can go down. And so there's a little bit of detraining added into the physiologic changes here. So who will notice the fall first? Well, this group up here is exercising regularly, and they're noticing that they can't do as much as they used to, right? So they're noticing that their physiology is changing. They're pretty bummed about it, I have to say. But down here, these people are just sort of going about their daily lives, not realizing that their capacity is actually falling. And that's significant because there's this threshold of disability. And below that, it's very hard for people to take care of themselves. to carry their groceries, to go upstairs. And so there's a loss of independence that happens down here. And you can see that in the sedentary group, that happens to a number of people in their 60s, but none of the endurance trained people have crossed over that threshold of disability. So even there is a fall in aerobic capacity, it still remains above that threshold of disability when they're training throughout their life. And that is where you want to ultimately end up. And it's not just function, it's also all-cause mortality or health, so death from any cause. And here's one of many studies that shows this relationship between exercise capacity and all-cause mortality. So this was done at the Palo Alto VA here with over 6,000 vets, and they measured the capacity of the vets on the treadmill, and they divided them up into quintiles of exercise capacity. So up here is the fittest group, and down here is the least fit group. And you have normal subjects and subjects that already have cardiovascular disease. And so this is relative risk of death over here compared to the most fit group. And you can see that there's sort of this exponential curve going down, so that by the time you get to the least fit group, they are 4 to 4.5 times more likely to die of any cause in the 7-year follow-up than the group that was most fit. So there's this well-established relationship between fitness and all-cause mortality. You see a similar relationship with muscle strength as you do with cardiovascular fitness. And that is, if you do not do any resistance training, you are less strong to begin with, and you fall more rapidly, and you end up at this critical range. If you train regularly throughout your life, you will start stronger. And in this case, the fall is less steep, and you end up having a great deal of functional capacity in your later years. And this is just sort of a summary of literature data. It's not from one particular study, it's representative. But it's important to remember that you can change these parameters at any age. And so here's a study I like to show because it has the oldest mean age group of any of the studies that I could find. And so the mean age is 90. And it looked at frail elderly men and women in the long-term care facility. And they put them on an 8-week training program of high intensity resistance training. So resistance training is just pushing against different resistance. And they increased the quadricep muscle strength by 174%, mid-thigh muscle area by 9%. And there was an increase in gait speed, stair climbing power, and balance. And there was an increase in spontaneous activity levels. So you often see this when you get people just a little bit stronger, then you get this cycling up of physical activity as people get more confident and more willing to try things. On the other side, if you have some type of incident that causes some bed rest or hospitalization, you can get a spiraling down as well that's very difficult to interrupt sometimes. But the bottom line is that you're never too old to benefit from exercise, and nothing so far is as effective at reversing muscle loss as resistance training. And so resistance training is important for everyone, but it's especially important as we age. And the reason for that is that it's much harder to maintain your muscle mass as you age. There's a variety of changes that take place in the body. And so whereas young people can kind of maintain that muscle mass by running around and doing their activities, as we get older, we need to really focus more on that and make it a more targeted activity. And it's not just about strength and power. It also has all of these advantages as well. So increasing longevity, reduced depressive symptoms, reduced systemic inflammation. And most people shy away from resistance training because it seems so complicated. You have reps and you have sets and you have percentage of 1 repetition maxes and all these different things. But there's been a movement recently to really simplify things down. And the bottom line is, if you're pushing against something that you haven't pushed against before or harder than you have, your muscles will respond. So that can be body weight exercises at home. It can be, stretch bands. It can be lifting milk cartons. It doesn't have to be in a gold gym type setting. And there are a lot of resources online if you just type in, starting resistance exercise program that can get you going. But there's been this push recently to include resistance exercise as a countermeasure for chronic disease. And there's a reference here by McLeod that sort of addresses some of those issues. if you're interested. I think they're going to pop it in the chat. All right, so that's the functional stuff, pretty straightforward. Now we're going to get into some nerdy science stuff, all right? So it's fascinating to me how this is all connected. So how does, walking to the corner store or walking up a flight of stairs, how does that impact, disease risk and cognitive function and longevity and mitochondrial health and cellular age of senescence? It's really a fascinating idea. And there are a lot of ways they're connected, but I want to address this crosstalk between systems in one particular area that I think you'll find interesting. And that is that your muscles actually serve as a pharmacy, right? So they are releasing all sorts of compounds that are signaling to the rest of your body. So there are these things called myokines. So myo is muscle, and they're signaling molecules that are released. And about 20 years ago, I think the first one was IL-6, was discovered that it was released in response to exercise. So this signal was going out to notify other tissues. And now they know about 650 to 3,000, depending on who you ask or how many different species you include. And the bottom line is we only understand a small portion of how these things work. And the ones that are released during exercise are called exerkines. And so it's kind of like Santa paying attention to how you've been throughout the year. Have you been naughty or nice? Have you been exercising or sedentary? Well, the rest of your body will know through these exerkines. So I put this up not to freak you out, but just to show you sort of the complexity of the system. So this is a simplified version of what's going on. And you can see it's already complicated. And I just put it up to show you that your muscle here, as you're moving it, as you're walking, as you're running, whatever, it's signaling to your skin, to your brain, to your vascular system, your bones, your liver, your gastrointestinal tract, your immune function, adipose tissue. All these different things are receiving signals and knowing that you're exercising. So they work through a lot of different functions, but one key function I want to explore today, and that is that a lot of them are anti-inflammatory molecules. So what does that mean? So what do we know about inflammation? Well, targeted acute inflammation is good. Like when you sprain your ankle and molecules go in there to try and fix your ankle, that's the repair process. But systemic chronic inflammation is bad. So systemic inflammation is associated with many diseases, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, dementia, et cetera. Obesity and sedentary behavior and poor diet increases systemic inflammation, and physical activity increases acute inflammation, but decreases chronic inflammation through changes in exerkines. So great, what does that mean? Well, let me give you a little scenario of what might be happening with these myokines. So it's COVID, you're working from home, you're sitting at your desk, you've become more sedentary. And so your background elevated of some not so good myokines may be high, right? So you have high systemic inflammation. You can kind of think of it as having a bunch of teenagers at home during COVID. So they have all this energy pent up. They have nothing to direct it to. So your house is a wreck. They've wrecked the joint. There's the TV's on, their dirty underwears everywhere. They have milk cartons on the counter. It's just crazy, like all this energy. So we'll come back to the teenagers in a moment. But you've taken this body hacking class now, and you realize you need to get up and at least start walking a little bit, if not running. And so during that physical activity, you're going to release myokines, and these myokines are going to have many benefits, and I'll come back to some in a moment. But also during exercise, you're going to get maybe some micro damage, some oxidative stress, some things that need to be addressed after exercise. And so your acute inflammation will increase. So then you go through this period of afterburn where your metabolic rate is elevated and you're trying to sort of get back to homeostasis. So you're trying to get your body back to where it was at rest. And so your circulating myokines will fall because they will focus on repairing that damage that happened during exercise. So repairing any micro damage in the muscle or mitochondria or DNA. And it's kind of like when you send your kids out to then your teenagers out to play in a soccer game, right? They have all this energy and now they focus it on the game. So it's productive. You know, they're scoring goals, they're doing well, they're using that energy for something productive. And that's sort of what it's like after the exercise bout. And you go through these repair processes where you repair the muscle. And while you're in there, you know, things are activated like, oh, there's something wrong with that mitochondria over there. I think I'll fix that while I'm up and running. And so it's like when you call a contractor in your house to fix a hole in the wall, and they're like, oh, yeah, it'll be $2,000. And they come in and they take apart the wall and then they say, oh, you have dry rot. And oh, by the way, your foundation is not up to code. I can fix that while I'm here. It'll be an extra $5,000. So it'll cost you in that afterburn period a little extra, whole wheat toast with avocado, but you will start repairing the damage that it accumulated from other sources. And so your damaged mitochondria might then be improved and look like this young, perky mitochondria. So then you're in this recovery and adaptation period, and you get your system ready for the next time. So you have lower resting systemic inflammation and decreased disease risk. Notice this woman's now standing because she understands that sitting is not so good for her. So it's when the teenagers come back into the house after their soccer game, they're all mellow, the energy level in the house is lower and done, and the house is no longer wrecked. So that's the equivalent of your system. So what are some of the many benefits that you get from these exerkines while you're exercising? Well, one that I find really intriguing is the idea that exercise impacts the brain. So those sort of separate entities, like how does that happen? Well, we'll take our little myokine exerkine example. So you're exercising your muscle, it releases the myokines circulate around to the brain, and the brain will release growth factors. And these growth factors can come from the muscle themselves or within the brain, but they have a very beneficial effect on your brain. So you can increase angiogenesis, so new blood vessels, and you can increase neurogenesis, the formation of new brain cells. So contrary to what some people believe, you're not stuck with a certain amount of brain cells that just deteriorate over time. You're constantly remodeling and creating new ones depending on your activities. We also know that exercise with these myokines decreases systemic inflammation. So that actually enhances the activity of these growth factors as well. And then there'll be structural and functional changes. So you'll get increased blood flow to the brain, increased vascularization, better cardiovascular function, and less obesity, type 2 diabetes, and plaque. And so all these things that impact the integrity of the vessels will go down. So you will get more blood flow to the brain. So you increase nutrient and oxygen delivery, both acutely during exercise and in the long term in response to these changes. And you can get actually increased brain size. So you see this in children who are active versus children who are not, and have bigger brains, certain regions of the brains in those children. And then as we age with physical activity, there's less decline, in size of certain key regions that are responsible for memory and executive function. So altogether, you have an increase in cognitive function, in memory and executive function. And there's a couple more tidbits here that I think are relevant. And that is sort of what kind of exercise. So endurance exercise has been studied a lot and has a big effect on brain health. Resistance exercise, a little less so, and high intensity interval training, there's some new data to suggest that that's working as well. Working out in enriched environments augments the effect of exercise. So when you're talking about an animal model, for example, that's comparing a mouse that might be running on a treadmill in a cage, on a wheel in a cage. If you take that mouse and you put it in an enriched environment where it has to go through a maze, or it has to play with others or go through an obstacle course, the impact on the brain is greater. There's a greater augmenting of neurogenesis in the brain. So this translates to humans for the idea that learning new sports where you're active and you're laying down new neural pathways like paddleboarding, learning new dance steps and dance moves, those can be all beneficial to the brain. Or if you're stuck in the gym riding the treadmill or riding the exercise bike there, trying to learn a new language or something like that, so you're laying down new pathways. And although there's not a lot of data on it, it sort of makes sense that exercising outside would be an even stronger impetus for your brain to remodel, because you're out there, you're looking where you're putting your feet on the trail, you're looking at the scenery, you're deciding where to go. All of those things sort of impact your brain function. You know, it's very intriguing to me that there's this connection between the body and the brain. So why would that be? Well, there's this theory called the adaptive capacity model that says that because of our evolutionary history, that this kind of activity was optimal for us and it improved our ability to find food. So this idea that when you're running through the woods, you know, looking for food to forage for, or looking for prey, you're activating your motor control, so your movement, you have to work your spatial orientation and navigation. So how do you get around that cliff? Your executive function, memory and planning, trying to remember where was the last time you saw that deer or that food, that fruit. And then your sensory and attention systems are activated. So, you know, you hear a rustle over there, it might be a deer, or do you smell some kind of possible food source over there? And all of those are working together. So unacutely, we've already talked about how it increases brain blood flow, increases myokines, increases growth factors, and cognitive multitasking. So if you do that over a long period of time in chronic activity, physical activity, then you're going to improve your brain function or maintain it as we age. On the other hand, if you're not doing those types of activities, then this energy conservation process kicks in. So this applies to your brain, to your muscles, to your bones, whatever. But if you're not using something, it's very energy costly to maintain it in your body. And so your body chooses to use that energy in other ways. So if you're not using your brain, if you're not being physically active, then you can get a decrease in brain function. So the adage, you know, use it or lose it, is certainly true. So I was trying to think about, you know, what would be the best type of physical activity for your brain? And something like orienteering would be great, right? You're out in the woods and you're trying to look for different spots you have to find with your GPS or whatever, or maps. But, you know, not many of us actually live in the woods. So I was thinking we needed something to do here in an urban setting. So I came up with the Safeway shopping sprint. And this woman's already dressed for it, right? And the idea would be that you run through Safeway as fast as you can and collect all of your groceries. So you'd have to avoid different shopping carts, right? So you have to get your spatial orientation, your coordination down. And then, you know, you'd have to find the food, and Safeway is always moving the food around. So you'd have to, you know, replan on the fly. And now the bread's all the way on a different aisle. And every time you see someone without a mask, then you'd have to try and avoid them like they were some kind of predator. And then if you really want to up the game, you could actually put real predators into the store, like this bear filmed in the produce aisle in the Tahoe Safeway. That would really liven up things. And that would be the ultimate paleo workout. So I think it would be good for your brain. It'd be a lot of fun. You know, adding the bears is just a bonus. And so I think we can call it the urban forage. And it could be, you know, the next fitness fad for 2021. And you can say that you heard about it here first. I'm sure Safeway would love it. It'd be great. All right, back to reality. If we stay active, can we be young forever, right? That's the question we want answered. Well, an 80-year-old will never really look like a 20-year-old. There's a lot of things that physical activity can impact and change the trajectory of aging, but cannot completely reverse. So changes in hormones, stem cell activity, cumulative damage, et cetera. So there will be an aging process that takes place. Unless you look like Bob Del Montague here, who's age 85 and trainer to the stars, a fitness guru. I think Bob's had a little bit of work done though. He has probably new teeth, maybe some pec implants, a little bit of testosterone, but he's looking really fine at age 85. But most of us will not look like that at age 85. So one way to address this issue is to look at masters athletes. So these are athletes who are training hard throughout their life and setting world record times, right? So you can eliminate some of the detraining element there. And if you look at the world record times for 100 meters and 10Ks, you can see there's a consistent pattern. You see this in a lot of other sports as well. So 30s, 40s, 50s, if this is performance time here, across the lifespan, 65, 70, and around 75 or so, there's this change in trajectory, this accelerated decline in speed. And you see it about the same point in the 10K as well. And so there seems to be something around that age where physical activity can no longer sort of compensate for the trajectory of aging. But it's hard to know whether that's biobehavioral or purely physical. So around that same time, self-selected walk pace declines. So maybe people are choosing not to push themselves as hard. And if you look across species like flies and mice and monkeys and humans about equivalent age, then there's a reduction in spontaneous physical activity around that age. So it could be here that the faster people are dying off around this age, but this reduction in spontaneous physical activity across different species suggests that there really is something going on at that age. So there's good news and bad news. So this graph could represent a lot of different things: bone density, muscle strength, cardiovascular fitness. And you get this increase throughout childhood up to 20, 30 years old. And then you get a decrease through adulthood, and then a more rapid decrease later in life, possibly crossing over this threshold of disability. But if you're active all your life, you get this bump up in the curve. So your peak values in your late 20s are higher. And in some cases, the trajectory of the aging is less steep. And then you still get this more accelerated decline later in life, but you end up well above this threshold of disability. And the further good news is that even if you start exercising later in life, then you still get that bump up. Not as much as if you were active your whole life, but maybe enough to keep you above that threshold of disability. So it is really never too late to start. So let's address how much, so the minimum amount needed for health, and then the maximum. So is there an upper limit in terms of health? So in order to do that, I want to bring us back to the physical activity guidelines and put them in those contexts. So this is a paraphrasing of the general guidelines. Essentially, they suggest that you get at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week of cardio. And the more intense it is, the less you have to do. So maybe down to 75 minutes, and you can do some combination thereof. And that can be broken up into shorter sessions. So that's something that's been added more recently. So you don't have to do like a 30-minute block. You can do 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, whatever throughout your day. They also suggest that you do resistance exercise and flexibility exercise, and all muscle groups 2 to 3 times per week. And then some neuromotor exercise, so working on balance, agility, gait, also 2 to 3 times a week. And they've added this more recently to avoid sitting whenever possible, because it's its own health risk factor. We'll talk about that later. So this is a lot of time. This is the reason why people aren't meeting the guidelines, is it's a lot of time to put into their day. So one way to address this issue of, can you get away with less? Is there an impact at lower levels than the guidelines? Is to look at the relationship between moderate, vigorous physical activity and all-cause mortality. And there are a lot of studies that look at this, and they all have very similar shaped graphs. And so the Health and Human Services Department in the last physical activity guidelines sort of consolidated those graphs into this shaped curve here. And what it says is if your risk of mortality here is normalized at 1 for the least active group, as you increase physical activity on this x-axis, you have a very steep early slope, and then it starts to flatten out. And you can see the physical activity guidelines here. So I want to draw attention to this side, the left side of the graph here, where you go from no physical activity to just a little bit, that first group, and you can decrease your risk of all-cause mortality by 20%. Once you get down to the guidelines, even on the early ends of the guidelines, then you're about 70% of the benefit is reached. And then the curve really starts to flatten out. So down here, you're training for something besides longevity. You're really training for performance. And a lot of the health benefits have already been obtained, which is fine. But you can see that the big gains come at this low end. So we'll address how much activity that is in just a moment. So, I mentioned that only 20% of adults actually meet the physical activity guidelines, but it's actually worse than that because there are 50% of the population, of adult population, get no leisure time physical activity. So the far left of that curve. And that's compared to back in 1988, when you average the men and women together, only about 15% claimed that they got no leisure time physical activity. So again, we're going in the wrong direction. And this 50% of the adult population that do nothing is a great target for public health goals, right? To get people who do nothing a little bit more active can impact individual health and public health as well because of that drop-off in all-cause mortality. So let's look at one more example of this because I want to put some numbers to this of how much activity we're talking about. So this is a study that looked at over 15,000 men and women and established essentially the same amount, the same shaped curve here. So here's the amount of physical activity and all-cause mortality risk. And this is doubled every increment here. So up here, it's on a straight graph, and you can see how sharp that curve is at the early side of the physical activity levels. So this first drop down to 30% reduction in all-cause mortality happens at between 0 and 5 MET hours per week. So what are we talking about here? Well, a MET is a metabolic equivalent. So it's essentially your metabolic rate as you're sitting there right now watching the show. So your resting metabolic rate. And then 2 METs would be you double that rate. 3 METs, you triple it. So when you get up to the moderate range, you're at 6 or 7 METs, and vigorous would be 14, 15, something like that. So 0 to 5 MET hours per week. So that's how much you've elevated your metabolic rate throughout the week. And so let's just look at some numbers to give us an idea. So walking briskly is 3.3 METs per hour, essentially. So 3.3 METs per hour. So that puts us close to this. So maybe walking for an hour and a half, 70 minutes, 10 minutes a day can drop all-cause mortality by 30%. So introducing just that little amount of physical activity. And then if you're, bicycling, you get more MET hours, running more MET hours, and even just running 10 minutes a day can have a very dramatic effect on your health curve. And I mentioned that the more intense your exercise, the less you have to do. And so in the last 10 years, there's been a huge fad in high intensity interval training. And there are a lot of different protocols out there, 2 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 20 seconds on, 2 minutes off, the 30, 20, 10, the 20-second, 2-minute protocol. And they all work. I mean, they all follow the same idea. And that is that you have these periods of intense physical activity separated by lower physical activity, so that you have this period of going up and down in physical activity. And there's some very interesting things metabolically that happen when you do that. And you also recruit sort of more power fibers. And we can talk about that in the question and answer period if you're interested. But the bottom line is that it's a very time efficient way to improve your VO2 max, your endurance, your mitochondrial mass and function, and your health. And a lot of people like it because it is so targeted. And even AARP is now recommending HIIT for its members. But in addition to the interval training, it is really good in your life to push that upper limit on occasion, right? So as you age, your maximum capacity tends to decline. Right? And so activities that you normally do will get harder and harder as that relative intensity gets closer to your maximum, right? So it feels harder if your maximum is declining. So people tend to shy away from the high intensity exercise as we age. And if it's possible and it's not high risk, you can keep working on that to keep that maximum capacity up, and it makes all the other things in your life a lot easier to do. But if you haven't tried any maximal exercise, you should contact your physician first and work out a training plan. All right, so what about sitting? So the opposite end of the high intensity. So you've probably seen these headlines, the perils of sitting, sitting kills, sitting is the new smoking, right? And they're a little bit exaggerated, but there is this issue with our sedentary time beyond just not exercising, but sitting per se. So what do we know about sitting? Well, on average, adults in the US sit about 9.3 hours per day. It's an independent risk factor for disease. So when you control a lot of other variables in people's lives, if they're sitting more, they're at higher risk for disease. Prolonged sitting impacts body mass index, fats, glucose, diabetes, et cetera. And interrupting sitting may help, right? So if you take two groups of people and they sit the same total amount of time, but you simply get this group up, for 2 minutes every half an hour or a couple minutes every hour, then their health parameters will improve and these will decline. So interrupting the sitting, not having continuous sitting is helpful. And then we also know that outside activity is only partly protective. So I have this watch that I wear, a lot of Garmin watch. Many of you have monitors that get you up and moving periodically. And so when I started wearing this watch about 10 years ago, it was kind of pissing me off a little bit because I would go out for a long cross-country ski and every hour after that, I'd sit down for lunch and an hour later would buzz and try and get me out of my chair. I'm like, 4 hours isn't enough exercise for you. But it turns out that my watch knew the literature quite well. And doing outside activity is great, but it doesn't mean that you can sit continuously the rest of the day. You lose some of the benefit of that activity. And so, most of the watches now, devices, Fitbits, whatever, will buzz you periodically and try and get you out of your chair. And there's good reason for that. So this is a graph that was put together by Health and Human Services to sort of show that interplay between sitting and physical activity. So if you have daily sitting time over here and moderate to physical activity over here, you can see that they relate to one another, in that if you're getting a lot of vigorous physical activity, then you're probably okay in the sitting department. But if you're like most people, sort of hanging out in this area, then you get benefit from the physical activity. But if you're sitting the rest of the day, you get kind of in the yellow zone, maybe even up to the orange zone here. And so you're losing the benefit that you would normally get from that physical activity, from that leisure time physical activity. So you need to be cognizant of what's happening the rest of your day, even if you're meeting the guidelines for physical activity, which is fantastic. And not all sitting is the same. So this gentleman here sitting in the office, he's sitting for 9.5 hours a day. And then we have the Hadza in Tanzania, a hunter-gatherer tribe, and they're sedentary 10 hours a day. But look at the difference in the way they're sitting. So this guy's leaning back in his chair, he's slouching forward. He's not using any of his postural muscles to keep him upright. These people here are sitting without backs to their chairs. They're squatting in some cases. They're having to hold their core upright. And so they're using their muscles in this sort of active sitting process. They may be doing work, they may be reaching for things, they may be digging. And so it's not the same type of passive sitting that we do in today's world. And also outside of the sitting, the Hadza are getting 20,000 steps per day, where the average US adults get 4,500 steps per day. So that impacts things as well. So the bottom line is that lifestyle or short, intense activities can help your overall health profile. And it's surprising how little you need in order to bump yourself up the health curve. So things like walking your dog, carrying your groceries, taking stairs, all of those add up throughout the day. And you can see that in the Hadza women who start off as young women at comparable strength as women in the US. And over time, the women in the US sort of get weaker and weaker as they age, and the Hadza women stay pretty much stable. And they're not going to the gym and working out. They are having these lifestyle activities for foraging for food, carrying water, helping with the grandchildren. All of these are keeping their strength up throughout the lifespan. So what about too much exercise? Well, this isn't talked about quite as much because it impacts so few people. So maybe about 2 to 3% of the population may be in this category. But if you're in that percentage, it's important. So the traditional view is that, more exercise is better and you get the most benefit at high-end exercise. But more recently, there's been an adjustment to that curve, and it starts to become a reverse J curve, so that over a certain point, you start to lose the benefit of the high activity level. And where this curve comes up to depends on the researcher and the data that they're looking at. But the real critical question is, where is this point? Here. So where do you start to lose those health benefits? And it's really hard to tell. And it probably varies from person to person. So here's what we do know. That when you're talking about people over 45 to 50, this is when this really starts to come into play. Because when you're younger, you have such robust repair mechanisms that if you're running back-to-back marathons and such, you can usually compensate. But if you're continuing that activity into your later years, when you can't repair damage as rapidly, then you need to start paying attention to the high intensity and long duration activity. So excessive high intensity or duration. So when you look at blood markers of cardiac damage after a marathon, they can be elevated after a single marathon. But normally, you have plenty of time to recover and you see no permanent damage in cardiac tissue. But if you're stacking back-to-back marathons or doing multiple ultra-endurance race in a year, then people have started to see that there's scar tissue that gets laid down from the excessive stretching of the heart and calcification. And hardcore endurance athletes are coming in with high levels of atrial fibrillation. So it is having some effect, but not on everyone. And it's hard to tell who's going to be impacted. There may be a genetic component. The data is not terribly robust because there's so few people who are actually in that category. And it may depend on how much recovery time they do, how they race, how they run, who they are, all sorts of factors that are hard to pin down at this time. But it makes sense to me because our bodies like moderation, right? So whether you're talking about red wine, a couple glasses are good, but if you drink too much, you're a wino, or water, we need it to survive. But if you're going to a fraternity hazing event and they force you to drink water can actually kill you. So chocolate in small amounts, good, large amounts, not so good. So it doesn't surprise me that exercise kind of falls into that category as well. And so that means that there's a difference between training for performance and training for longevity. And a great analogy that I heard recently is comparing a Formula One car to a Honda Accord, for example. So a Formula One car, fast, powerful, not built for longevity. It'll probably go through, 3 engines in a season. Honda Accord, you go at a moderate pace, you give it some oil every once in a while, and it can go for 200,000 miles, right? So longevity versus performance. So that brings us to the recommendations. So if you're training for performance, and I'm applying this to people maybe over at age 50, then that's great. There's a lot of benefits from that. Your training is going to be focused. You're going to have specificity of training for the event that you're going for. You're going to do progressive overload to add on to your capability in that event. You should still follow the 80-20 training, which means that 80% of your training should be a low intensity, lower than you might expect, and 20% should be very high intensity. And elite athletes are starting to transfer over to this training regimen. And I don't have time to go into details on it, but there's a lot of information online. If you are training for events, you should be thinking about this. It ends up being better for performance and better for your heart in these endurance activities. So the advantages for training for performance: you're strong, you're fit, you have increased health benefits relative to sedentary, you have a sense of accomplishment, high self-esteem, you have social interaction at the events, you look great in Lycra, probably, maybe. And disadvantages: you may give up some health benefits relative to moderate exercise, and there's some opportunity costs there. So to be focused on a particular type of performance, you're not doing certain other things. So you become a less rounded athlete and person. And we know that life is a cross-training sport. There are a lot of things that come your way. You want to make sure that you can meet them. Training for longevity is a little bit different. You want to meet the physical activity guidelines, so moderate exercise or a ways above that, but not into the extreme category. You want to have some bouts of high intensity exercise to keep that maximum capacity as high as you can. You want to move throughout your day and reduce your amount of sitting. And you want to do a variety of activities and add some resistance training. And get outdoors and be social and play. There was a very interesting study that came out of Copenhagen that looked at types of activities that people did and the amount of years it added to life. And it was a very surprising. All the activities added, all the physical activities added years of life. But the least effective one was gym activity, and that's a huge category, but working out in the gym. Next was running, cycling, and swimming. And then the category that added the most years to life were things like tennis, golf, badminton. So a surprising finding, but it brings in sort of the outdoor activities, the social activities, and something that you can do for long periods of time. So it's very interesting. So the advantages to training for longevity, that you compress morbidity, so you're healthier for longer and disease comes later in your life, and possibly add years of life, so your longevity. As you enjoy movement and life more, you increase function and independence. Disadvantages, you won't win any marathons, and life may be less convenient. So what I mean by that is, in order to get that movement in your life throughout your day, to keep moving throughout the day, you have to make choices away from those things that we have for convenience. So walking instead of driving, doing some of your own chores, not using machines to do those. And so taking the stairs, for example. So making your life less convenient adds physical activity into your daily life. So in summary, your body is watching you. And to age well, you want to move regularly throughout the day, do it with others, and play whenever possible. And remember, a convenient life is not necessarily a healthy life. So thank you for that. I'll let Anne come back on and bring up some questions. I just want to mention about the online classes, though. We will send out an email in the next couple of days with some links to those classes if you're interested in signing up and learning more about how your body exists in the world. So altitude, heat, cold, stress, that, and then a class on aging as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Friedlander. All right, so our first question, what should we do if we have been captive at our desks during COVID? Can we recover?
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of the human body, is it's extremely resilient, right? So we have been sitting more than we're used to, but you can compensate at any age and at any stage. So tomorrow is a new day. And so if you integrate more movement into your day tomorrow, then you're already on a path to better health. So nothing that happens before should really impair your ability to sort of come back from that. So if you've been sitting a lot, take the time to start a new pattern tomorrow, and it will impact your health.
Okay, do less strenuous exercises like yoga and qigong affect longevity? And also, do you have any recommendations for those who don't naturally gravitate to yoga and stretching?
Yeah, so those activities are very good for longevity. They build strength, they increase focus, they decrease anxiety. All of those sort of fall into that category of things that help you live longer. It's good to also throw in some additional activity that might get your heart rate up a little bit higher as well, to make sure you're getting that cardiac work in your different exercise patterns. But there's no doubt that those two things, the meditating, the breathing, the yoga, the building the strength, all of those are going to help with longevity as well. And incidentally, there are studies that look all the way down at the cellular level with things like meditation, that they can increase insulin sensitivity. Herbert Benson has done a lot of work of this at Harvard. And so, there are these mind-body connections that are really powerful. And so working on your mind can also impact your body.
What should a reasonably healthy 68-year-old be striving for in an exercise regimen? Intensity, duration, frequency?
So I would say that they're all sort of important. Intensity on occasion to keep your maximum capacity high, and then as much duration as you can put in will also augment different types of pathways. So they work different systems, and it's hard to say that it's hard to say specifically because I don't know where you're coming from. I don't know if you're already an endurance athlete or you're just trying to start something new. But again, integrating these movements into your day in addition to the physical activity guidelines will be optimal.
I'm 85 now and trying to remain active. I walk a lot every day, but don't do much other exercise. What recommendations do you have for other exercises? I'm looking for reasonable ways to stay mobile.
Yeah, so walking's a great one, right? That's what our hunter-gatherers used to do most of the time, that sort of moderate, brisk walking. Again, I would emphasize that if you can push the upper limit a little bit, so even if it's walking one side of the block a little bit more slowly and then accelerating on the other side and then walking again, just to get that changeover from the lower intensity exercise to the slightly higher intensity exercise, that can be really powerful. And the other thing that I would add would be something to increase whole body strength. So some type of resistance exercise program, and it can be, body weight exercises or whatever, to make sure that you're keeping that functional strength up.
What type of weight training is effective for 60-year-olds, and does this affect longevity?
Absolutely. So they've done studies that look at tertiles of strength, and if you're in the upper two tertiles of strength, then you have increased longevity, so decreased all-cause mortality. So it is another factor that plays into longevity. And so as I mentioned in the talk, for people who are just starting out resistance training, they're steering away from the complex sets, reps, whatever. So right now you can do, a single set of compound exercises. So doing push-ups, sit-ups, whatever, and just keep upping the number you're doing, and you're going to get increases in strength. And that's what you're striving for. Again, there are a lot of resources on this online, more than I can go into in this question and answer period. But just starting to do something more than you're already doing, some type of resistance, will start to increase the strength. You'll start to see those gains.
What is it about sitting per se that puts us at greater risk of disease? How much sitting is too much?
Great question. So sitting, there's a couple mechanisms with the sitting that increases your risk for disease. So as I'm actually standing, you could probably tell because I'm shifting around. So as I'm standing here, I'm using my postural muscles to hold myself up. So those are your red muscles, your type 1 fibers for endurance. And they use fats and glucose in a very important way. And so just by keeping my muscles slightly contracted rather than sitting completely passively in the chair, I'm moving fuels through my body and I'm preventing them from accumulating in my blood. And the other thing is the myokines that we talked about. So as I'm standing here using my muscles, I'm releasing signals that's saying that I'm moving. And so, for example, as you exercise or as you move about, there's a particular myokine that targets visceral fat. And visceral fat is also this endocrine organ that releases things that can lead to insulin resistance. So if you are exercising, even if you're not losing weight, then you're decreasing visceral fat, and that can have an effect on systemic inflammation. So by not sitting as much, you're reducing systemic inflammation, and you're using fuels in a way that keep them from accumulating in the blood. And both of those are thought to have a big effect on health. And how much is too much? So that's a really tough question to answer because it really depends on the person. But the best analogy that I've heard is it's kind of like sunscreen and skin cancer, in that, you don't really know how much sun exposure is going to cause skin cancer, and it's different for individuals depending on risk factors and types of skin and everything. But you do know that less sun exposure is better, really, for most people to a certain point. And so that's what you need to be thinking about. Like, how can I interrupt my sitting? It's not a set number. It's how can I keep myself from being too passive for long periods of time?
Do you have any recommendations for arthritis, such as exercises that will prevent arthritis or new ways to reduce the pain? And will these recommendations work for bursitis too?
So yeah, arthritis is interesting. It's so frustrating because many people with arthritis want to exercise, and the pain is preventing them from doing that. And The catch-22 is that if you give into that pain and you don't exercise, it can get worse faster, right? So the moving of the joint, the putting the fluid back into the synovial capsule and keeping those fibers sliding against each other, all those can help arthritis, but you have to be able to overcome the pain. And so there are things that you can do to start to do slow warm-ups. You can take a hot bath. You can put a hot pad on them to sort of loosen those things up before exercising. But any kind of low impact activity will improve arthritis symptoms if you can get past that initial pain. And so consulting a physical therapist or your doctor is a good way to start to figure out how to get that activity in to prevent the progression of the disease. It's interesting because many people think that physical activity causes osteoarthritis, but in fact, that's not true. It's been shown over and over again that it's that sort of a J curve, that moderate physical activity will actually reduce the incidence of arthritis later in life. And then again, you get this kick up. So if you're a competitive runner, for example, and you get high loads on the joints, and that can start a process of degradation. But for the most part, running actually reduces the risk of osteoarthritis. Oh, and bursitis is a little bit different because it's an inflammation issue and you need it to heal before you can start exercising. So it doesn't get better necessarily if you're exercising with bursitis until it's healed, whereas arthritis, it actually tends to get better if you can get the exercise in.
What is the best weight bearing or any exercise to treat or prevent osteoporosis?
So ideally, if you were just trying to build bone, you would do box jumps, right? So you want to get a strong, sudden load on the skeleton. Repetitive motion is better than static motion. So walking's good. I mean, some people put on weighted vests to try and load the skeleton, but any kind of impact is going to be beneficial. So the walking, the running, things like swimming and biking are a little less beneficial for osteoporosis because you're just not loading the skeleton in the same way.
I don't do much upper body work. Any recommendations?
Same thing. You need to start incorporating an upper body workout in. So that can be, push-ups against the wall. It can be lifting weights at home. It can be going to the gym. I mean, there are a lot of different things that you can do to try and increase the resistance of those muscle groups.
Can you speak to insomnia with age and how to mitigate waking in the middle of the night and not being able to get back to sleep?
Ooh, that's a challenging one. Not my area of expertise, and I know it's a big issue for a lot of people. In the context of physical activity, it has been shown that physical activity earlier in the day can really help sleep later at night, right? So not having physical activity right before you're trying to go to bed, but earlier in the day. But insomnia is a chronic problem and there's a lot of root causes of that. And so I don't think I can address that in great detail.
Is the hype about HIIT merited and why does it work so well?
Yeah, so high intensity interval training, as I mentioned, has been this fad for a number of years. And it was interesting. It started in 2006 by a paper by Gabala, who did a comparison in cyclists where he had one group exercise as hard as they could for 30 seconds, 4 to 6 times. And I think they did a total of 6 sessions, and each of those intense workouts was separated by a rest period. So the total amount of exercise time in 2 weeks was about 15 minutes. And then he compared it to a group that did 90 to 120 minutes of exercise on the bike at 65% of maximum. And the amazing thing was, to everyone's surprise, is the outcomes in VO2 max, time trial performance, mitochondrial changes were equivalent between the two groups. It was like, whoa, in a 10th the amount of time, we're getting the same responses. So it's very interesting because that process of going from low energy to high energy kind of tricks the body into thinking that you're doing more work than you actually are. And so your body gets this moment of fuel depletion when it can't ramp up the systems and it thinks, oh my God, we're fuel depleted. We must be doing endurance exercise. And so it upregulates a lot of the pathways that we used to think only came from high volume training. And also it allows you to go really hard for a short period of time. So you get to recruit your type 2 power fibers, which then, it brings in a whole nother energy pathway. So it is very effective. It's not all hype. I mean, it's a little bit hyped, but it is also a very efficient, effective way to get endurance adaptations and high-end adaptations as well in the muscle.
We know that adopting exercise offers benefits at any age, but has this been quantified in clinical trials?
It actually has been quantified in a number of clinical trials. So one that comes to mind is the diabetes prevention program, where they recruited 3,000 people, and I think their mean age was around 50, and they put them in different groups. And one of the groups was a lifestyle intervention group where they tried to meet the minimum guidelines for physical activity, so 150 minutes of brisk walking, and they had a healthy diet. And all of these people, when they started, were pre-diabetic. And so compared to the control group, the group that had the lifestyle changes at age 50 had a 58% reduction in the conversion to type 2 diabetes. So even starting later and very modest changes can have a big impact on a lot of variables. That's one example in the type 2 diabetes category, but there are many, many more that show similar things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedlander, for your wonderful presentation, and also to SAA staff for their assistance with this event. And thank you to all of you for coming. Your interest and questions have made for a really lively and engaging event. If you're interested in learning more about or joining the Monterey-based Stanford Club, we offer free email memberships, and we welcome new members regardless of where you live.